Thank you so much to Anna and to all of our speakers this morning. We have some time now for questions, discussion.
Yeah, it's curious. The French have Montesquieu Persian letters. They've got Voltaire around the same time, where Persia's ironic humor. A little bit later, Mozart is all irony and humor, whereas nationalism is very serious. And it seems to me that surrounding this world of Poland and even Germany with Zarathustra later, it's serious. So it's funny to have a sequence, a circumstance where there's irony and then there's seriousness dealing with the same foreign element. And then one point on yours, Titian with his women, I mean, that's sublime. I have one in gigantic, poster of one of his renditions. She's good, but she's no Titian. I'm just curious, and he's nearby in Venice, earlier, of course. I wonder how that played out. Did that show courage on her part to go tackling a genre that the greatest master of the age had sort of imprinted, or it's just something that you do and you have women wearing fabulous clothing?
I mean, in response to that, yeah, it's not really appropriation. It's not really Turkery. It's a bit more serious than that, because the noble classes did actually consider themselves as part of this Persian, Iranian, Ottoman lineage, which is unfounded, but it's something that became very, very deeply entrenched into Polish identity into the 20th century. And I've, from my own background, my own research, I've actually found that Sarmatia became a metaphor for this lost Polish independent state, even under communism. And there's a lot of literature that talks about Sarmatia, the return to Sarmatia, in the case of exiles and political emigres who left the country. And it just became this overriding and very entrenched national symbol of a country that I guess wasn't really there, even though it has this, I mean, historically, anthropologically, archaeologically, it's Iranian. It's a land that's nowhere near Poland at all. So yeah, it's different. It's much more serious than the kind of frivolity and Turkery that you have in Montesquieu and the Persian letters and the French and German appropriations there. Yeah.
As to your question around Lavinia Fontana, and I think it's important to situate her as really looking at painting as a trade through which she supported herself. And so also that was the focus of my presentation was her representation of nobility, but she did have several extremely large commissions by the church, and one in particular that I did not show by the Medici family, which are quite astounding, where she depicted, I think, Eleonora de Medici as Queen Sheba. So I definitely would encourage you to look at her work more. I'm not saying that she's Titian, but I'm saying that the focus of my presentation was more on her portraits of the women that she encountered on a regular basis, and her accurate portrayal of them and their luxurious items, more so than on her relative greatness, if you will, as a painter. But I'm willing to debate that someday if you would like.
So I have a question for Catherine, actually. I would love to hear more about the trade practices at the Gobelin factories in terms of the people actually putting together the tapestries and how that training process happened, who was behind, was Lebrun really at the front of that training, or was there kind of a more elaborate system?
Thank you. That's a very good question. The Gobelin, as you guessed, was a very large organization, and it worked. I think on the modern principle, if we think of it, as subcontractors. So there were 6 workshops inside the Gobelin. So it was, each process for the tapestry was very segregated. So the first thing would be the very small engraving or sketch, which would be prepared usually by Lebrun. Then there would be a team of painters who would paint the cartoons. When I showed on the screen the head of Alexander and the head of the man, the warrior with the lion skin on his head. So this would be accomplished by a separate team of specialized painters, and they would give, in turns, these cartoons to the various weaving workshops. Now, the weaving workshops each had several employees. In fact, I have a memorandum from Jan Jans the Younger that lists all of his employees. And as of 1688, he had 45 people working for him, and some of whom, what's great about his memorandum is that he does say, so-and-so has been here for 30 years. He apprenticed for so many years. So often weavers would start when they were 12 or 14. They would go through a serious period of apprenticeship, and then they would sort of rise in the ranks. But even then, it was highly specialized. So the weaver who would execute heads, for example, would be specialized and paid more than the weaver who did the flowers. And on any given, there was a contract in the letters, the original letters of the patent of the Gobelin that said that they could take up to 60 apprentices per year. So it was a big, it was a luxury machine. It was really a big operation. And Lebrun, as director, they called him, they said he had a little bit dictatorial tendencies. So apparently he was everywhere and he had to approve everything, but he was certainly not the one training.
Hi. I have a question for, I think, primarily Kat and for Catherine. Both of you in your presentations spoke about, to some extent, practitioners who produced for a great other, right? And in the course of that, somehow became great or celebrities themselves, if I understood it correctly. And that's interesting to me because it strikes me as not inevitable. For example, in Anna's paper, we saw a lot of porcelain, right, produced for others, but we don't know very much about those makers of those objects. So I'm curious if both of you or all of you might speculate a little bit about the mechanisms for that happening. So was it like that in the historical moments in which you're speaking, right? I mean, Lebrun was certainly part of a large court society. Or is this kind of celebrity that these makers are now achieving the result of art history, art historiography that are now attending to those practitioners?
Maybe I'll start since I still have the microphone. My theory, and this is really part of my thesis, which is Charles Lebrun was a master of self-promotion, probably above and beyond a master of painting or anything else. He was not of noble birth, but he did know his father was a sculptor, and he knew how to ingratiate himself with the right people. So he got in very early on with the Chancellor Séguier, who put him in touch with, Séguier was really close to Richelieu, and so this is how he got the right commissions. He was sent to Italy to work with Poussin. So he knew how to be in the right place at the right time, and it was certainly not, I think, a coincidence that he would pick the grandest of subjects for his patron. And again, he was early on, even before he started working for the king, he got a special permission to have, in effect, a copyright on his work so that they could not just be reproduced by anybody. And so he was very aware of the possibility of dissemination. And at the same time, in 1672, when the story of Alexander was so popular, he's the one who said, hey, Colbert, guess what? We should do reproductions of these. So my theory is that he was really, he was a social climber, and he was intent on getting a reputation. And the big irony of all that is that once he passed away and his supporter passed away, he faded from the limelight very quickly, and he's now often referred to as the célèbre oublié, the famous forgotten one. So it backfired.
As for Lavinia Fontana, I definitely don't think that celebrity is inevitable. It certainly takes a level of skill, but similarly to Charles Lebrun, Fontana's father was very much a promoter of her and basically strategized much of her early career, which has a lot of bearing on her later success. But the second element to that is, as I mentioned, she would often paint images at pivotal moments in noble women's lives. And I feel that there is a strong psychological correlation or component with whoever is going through these intense moments with you of betrothal, marriage, and the passing of a spouse. They become confidants. And so when she became a close friend of a noblewoman who also was able to paint a stunning portrait of that noblewoman, she became in demand in other noble circles at the same time. So it was kind of a very lucky confluence for her, and she was quite famous in her own time. I actually don't think art history has really forgotten about her because she's been in Italian museums for a long time, but she is definitely getting a new resurgence of attention recently.
I have one question for Anna. I'm curious about the context of viewing these porcelain figures and if there's a gendered component to that as well, in which, are primarily women collecting these, or are women buying women figures and men buying male figures? Are they in public areas of viewing in the home or in private areas, or maybe are they in both, but it depends on the kind of figure?
I mean, when it comes to viewing them at the time, they were definitely purchased by both, but they were also given as gifts by the king. He would reward his favorites with Meissen porcelain because everyone loved it. Like, they were nuts for this stuff. And so it was also a manner of like conveying political favor, as well as purchasing. The Polish nobility did commission them as well. I haven't found, there's scant documentary evidence that I could get my hands on. A lot of it is in what is left of it is in the archives in Poland, so it's kind of hard to get to. But they were also commissioned by specific noble families that those commissions went through the warehouse in Warsaw, went back to Meissen. They were produced in Saxony, and then they were sold at the warehouse throughout the 18th century. But when it comes to where it was placed in the home, that I don't know, unfortunately. I do know that they were displayed fairly prominently at the Hôtel Lambert in Paris. They were very much a key part of the collection there, but not. I don't know anything about where they would have been placed in the home. I have found some evidence that they were actually placed in the table with other porcelain. I guess it's on the table, but I can't really speak much to where exactly in the homes they would be. Yeah, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna, for reminding us that decorative arts objects have political opinions and are more than just about connoisseurship, as beautiful as they are. I was certainly struck by the ethnic quality of, with the Polish subject matter, of the male figures as opposed to the female figures. The female figures are clearly blonde Slovaks, while the male figures are definitely orientalized and Asian-looking. But of course, the Poles are all Slovaks and are all blonde. So what's your feeling about that, and how? The dichotomy between the male and the female figures is pretty strong in that sense.
No, it definitely is, and it's something that I did try to look at, and I wrote this paper actually for an international Rococo class, and we were talking about the gendered elements of the Oriental and how male figures were more Orientalized as a way to kind of, I don't know, I took the perspective in the paper of making collectors in the West feel more comfortable with it, because the Orientalizing of the male figure doesn't
It's less threatening.
it's less
right?
threatening, exactly. It's less
Yeah.
threatening to the European imagination than it is the orientalizing of the feminine figure. And it's something that I definitely, it's a great question, and I did look at, but it's kind of dicey because I don't have any exact evidence for that. But that's my take on it. It was to become, for the male figures to be less threatening to the European male imagination. As per, that happened a lot in the Rococo. So yeah, that would be my take on it.
No, really fascinating.
One of these microphones back.
I want to piggyback on that. I kind of disagree. I think that the orientation of the men was to make them more sexual and to appeal to women. And it was about making them exotic. And by doing that, you draw more appeal. So I don't think it was to make the West more comfortable. I think it was to intrigue the women. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's a very fair comment, and that's definitely part of it. There's the orientalizing of women doesn't happen, and I think that's a very good point, and that's something that I've also read about. Because women, I mean, in the Rococo literature that I've read, women were the ones that were consuming these Oriental objects. They were the ones in the French and English context. They were ones that were buying chinoiserie, that were buying these things, but
fantasizing.
Yeah, but there's also evidence that says a lot of writing, and I forget the French writer who wrote about this, that's very demasculinizing, taking away the masculinity of Oriental men, and that was very a pervasive thought at the time. So I mean, it could definitely be both, but I think you strike a very, very good point there. It was definitely to intrigue. Yes.